Today's a special episode. We'll talk about a lot of different things, but prior to going into it, if you don't know who Alan Dershowitz is, his resume is legendary. 50 years he taught at Harvard. He's represented some of the most interesting cases, O.J. Simpson, a lot of different cases. So he's had debate is what he does for a living. And on the complete opposite side, we have Robert Kennedy, where many call him a hero when it comes down to environmental crusader. He's also obviously a lawyer. They've both written books. Alan's recent book, which you can get free on Kindle right now, is Guilt by Accusation. It's on the topic of the Me Too movement. Your thoughts on it. So here's what was said in an interview a few weeks ago by Alan. Let's show a clip of this.
Let me put it very clearly. You have no constitutional right to endanger the public and spread a disease, even if you disagree. You have no right not to be vaccinated. You have no right not to wear a mask. You have no right to open up your business.
Wait, can I stop you? No right not to be vaccinated, meaning if they decide you have to be vaccinated, we have to be vaccinated?
Absolutely. And if you refuse to be vaccinated, the state has the power to literally take you to a doctor's office and plunge a needle into your arm. If the vaccination
Where is that in the Constitution?
If the vaccination is designed to prevent the spreading disease. If the vaccination is only to prevent a disease that you will get. For example, if there's a disease that will kill you, you have the right to refuse that, but you have no right to refuse to be vaccinated against a contagious disease. Public health, the police power of the Constitution, gives the state the power to compel that, and there are cases in the United States Supreme Court.
Having said that, I want to just pause for 1 second and say how important this debate is and how privileged I am to participate in it with so distinguished a conversationalist as Robert Kennedy. I, of course, knew his father. I was a great fan of Senator Robert Kennedy, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, and I think I consider myself a friend of the Kennedy family, and I consider myself a friend of Robert. But on the issue of constitutionality, I am confident that this Supreme Court would follow Supreme Court precedent from 1905 and would say if there is a safe, and that's crucially important, effective measure that could significantly reduce the contagious impact of a deadly disease like the current pandemic virus, that the state would have the power to either directly compel vaccination or, for example, condition young students coming to school on being vaccinated, but the constitutional issue, in my mind, remains the same.
So it's important to unpack that constitutionally, you're remaining same position to say, if the government wanted to mandate and make us take a vaccine, we can't say anything to it. That position is not changing.
That's right. As long as the vaccination is safe and effective, a healthy person who simply has an ideological objection to vaccinations as such, not to this particular vaccination because of health reasons or vulnerability, the Supreme Court would, I predict, hold that the state could, in one way or another, compel vaccination either directly or as a condition of people engaging in public activities or activities that could create contagion. Yeah, that's my position.
Well, I want to begin by thanking Alan for participating in this debate. And by the way, Patrick, you're familiar and Alan's familiar with my voice. I want to apologize for that at the outset. It's really bad in the morning. And I want to thank Alan for participating in this debate. I've actually been trying to do a debate on this issue for 15 years. I've asked Peter Hotez, I've asked Paul Offit, I've asked all of the major leaders of who are promoting vaccines to debate me, and none of them have. I will make a minor dispute, which is the Jacobson case, which was decided in 1905, was not a case where the state was claiming the power to go into somebody's home and plunge a needle into their arm, and kick down their door, and take them by force. The Jacobson actually was a guy who was resisting taking a smallpox vaccine. He was from Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the penalty for not taking the vaccine was a $5 fine. So it was like a traffic ticket. He decided to take it. He had been injured in a previous vaccine, so he didn't want to take this one. He took the case to the Supreme Court. He lost, and the remedy was he paid a $5 fine. So I think it's there's a big constitutional chasm between, that remedy, which is paying a fine, and actually going in and holding somebody down and forcibly injecting them. And I'm not convinced that the Supreme Court of the United States at this point would uphold that kind of law. That this should be a voluntary program. If there's mandates, they should be as an ultimate, final, dramatic, drastic remedy. And that really, and the question is, why can't we do a voluntary program? And today, that trust has evaporated to the extent where now 50% of the people who are polled in this country are saying they may not take the COVID vaccine, and 27% are a hard no. This is even before the vaccine is developed. Why is that happening? And that's the question I think we really have to ask ourselves. Why do so many Americans no longer trust our regulatory officials and trust this process? And one of the reasons is that it's a medical intervention that is being given to perfectly healthy people to prevent somebody else from getting sick. And it's the only medicine that's given to healthy people. So you would want, and particularly to children who have a whole lifetime in front of them, so you would expect that we would want that particular intervention to have particularly rigorous guarantees that it's safe. Because you're saying to somebody, we are going to make you make this sacrifice for the greater good. You have no health problems. You have zero risk of this disease. Yet we are going to force you to undergo a medical intervention. And our side of the bargain should be, we want this to be completely safe. And for anybody, and this, I think, is something that Alan really has to, I think, Alan, that you need to come to terms with in terms of crafting your own arguments about this. It's not hypothetical that vaccines cause injury and that injuries are not rare. The vaccine courts have paid out $4 billion, and the threshold for getting back into a vaccine court and getting a judgment, HHS admits that fewer than 1% of people who are injured ever even get to court. The other thing is vaccines are zero liability. So this is an industry that went to Congress in 1996, and they had a diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine at that time that was called causing brain injury in 1 out of every 300 people. And they said to Congress, we cannot make vaccines safely. They are unavoidably unsafe. That is the phrase in the statute, unavoidably unsafe. The only reason that we're going to continue to make vaccines is if you give us complete blanket immunity from liability. And Congress gave it to them. So today you have a product that if it injured you, no matter how negligent the company was, no matter how sloppy their line protocols, no matter how toxic the ingredients they choose to use, no matter how grievous your injury, you cannot sue that company. And that company, therefore, has no incentive to make that product safe. And that should be troubling to any of us who are part of the legal system that is saying we are going to force people to take this intervention.
I think you're going to have to concede, Robert, that the smallpox vaccine had an enormous positive impact on wiping smallpox from the face of the earth. Smallpox was a dreaded disease. The Black Plague back in many, many centuries ago, if there had been a vaccine back then, could have saved probably millions of lives. Wendell Holmes once made an analogy to, in an unrelated case, to being drafted into the Army. At that point in time, a young 18-year-old was told, look, Congress has given the Army complete exemption. We're not liable if you're shot by the Nazis or by the Japanese. You have to risk your life in order to protect other innocent people in the country. And it's not a perfect analogy, obviously, but it does show that the courts have given to the government the authority to sometimes make decisions that require you to sacrifice your life. But I don't think there's any family in the history of America that has ever made more sacrifices in the public interest than the Kennedy family. You know, it broke all of our hearts to see how much sacrifice the Kennedy family personally made. Sacrifice is part of the American tradition, and the Americans owe the Kennedy family an enormous debt of gratitude for their sacrifices. Now, those were voluntary sacrifices. And obviously, we're talking about a very different thing. We're talking about involuntary acts. But being drafted is an involuntary act. Again, to mention the Kennedy family, the oldest brother of the Kennedy family volunteered to serve in the Army and was killed in combat as a great hero. So we demand sacrifices, and we don't demand perfection. I mentioned that when we were kids, I remember not being able to swim in the summers of 1953, 4, 5 because of polio. My friend died after being on a lung machine. And the blessing that we all made to Salk and Saban for developing the vaccine. But there were consequences. People took the vaccine and did suffer. In the end, though, polio was wiped out. And Robert and I completely agree that the program should begin by giving it only to volunteers. We should only get to this terrible, tragic choice issue in the end, if it's absolutely essential that people who don't want to be vaccinated have to be vaccinated to get the kind of herd immunity. We all agree with that. But we live in such a divided time that everything has become politicized. On July 4th, the Reverend Farrakhan made a speech to almost 1 million people in which he urged Black people not to take the vaccine because we know the history of how Black people were experimented on during the terrible Tuskegee time. And yet Black people and Latino people and people of color are the most vulnerable to the illness. Is that a smart thing for Farrakhan to have urged his community?
The proposition and the theology that smallpox and polio were abolished due to vaccination is controversial. That is not a proposition that is universally accepted. And if you notice, all the infectious diseases, whether it was scurvy or tuberculosis, for which there were no vaccines, along with puerperal fever and diphtheria and pertussis and measles, all disappeared at the same time without vaccination. Now, CDC actually examined that because it became such a part of the orthodoxy of vaccines that the idea that smallpox and polio were abolished because of vaccines and these other diseases. They did. John Hopkins and the CDC in 2000 did a comprehensive study of that proposition. And the conclusion of that study is that the abolishment of mortalities from infectious diseases that took place during the first half of the 20th century had virtually nothing to do with vaccines. It had everything to do with sanitation, with nutrition, with hygiene, with electric refrigerators, with reduction in population densities, and essentially engineering solutions. There was a guy called Edward Cass, who was the head of Harvard Medical School at that time, who gave a very, very famous speech in which he warned that people who were promoting vaccines and other technologies would try to take credit for those reductions in mortalities from infectious disease. And he said, beware of them, because they'll try to monitor that, they'll try to monetize them, and use that to increase their power and their prestige. So today's kids have to take 72 vaccines, 72 doses of 16 vaccines in order to stay in school. And that explosion of new vaccination came in 1989, right after the passage of VICA, Vaccine Act. The Vaccine Act gave blanket immunity from liability to vaccine companies. And so those companies all of a sudden looked around and they said, holy cow, now we've got a product where we are completely excused from the highest cost from that afflicts every other medical product, which is the downstream liability for injuries. That's the biggest cost for every medicine. Not only that, vaccines have another exemption that most people don't know about. They are the only medical product that does not have to be safety tested against a placebo. And that exemption is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service, which was a quasi-military agency, which is why people at the CDC have military ranks like Surgeon General and they wear uniforms. The vaccine program was conceived as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country, and they wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with a biological agent, anthrax or something like that, that we could quickly formulate a vaccine and deploy it to 200 million American civilians without regulatory impediments. They said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to test it. And that takes 5 years to do double-blind placebo testing. So let's call it something else. We'll call it a biologic, and we'll exempt biologics from safety testing. So not a single one of the vaccines, the 72 vaccines now administered to our children, have ever been tested against a placebo. You know how many days the current polio vaccine, you know how many days it was safety tested for, Alan? 48 hours. The hepatitis B vaccine, the Glaxo version, was 4 days. The Merck version, 5 days. That means that if the baby they gave that to had a seizure on day 6, it never happened. If the baby died on day 6, it never happened. If the baby got food allergies that were diagnosed 2 years later, it never happened. If the baby got autism, which is not diagnosed till 4 years of age, 4.2 years of age, it never happened. Autoimmune diseases, you cannot see those if you have these short-term studies, and you can't see any risk if you don't test against a placebo. And my question is, nobody knows, because of that, nobody knows the risk profile for any vaccine that is currently on the schedule. And that means nobody can say with any scientific certainty that that vaccine is averting more injuries and deaths than it's causing. And my question is, how in the heck can we be mandating to children that they take a medical product for which we do not know the risks? And to me, that is criminal. How do you avoid the whole discussion about mandating vaccines? The way that you do that is you have a transparent process. And yet, what we've seen from the current group of COVID vaccines is none of that's happening. They're skipping key parts of the test. A Moderna vaccine, which is the lead candidate, skipped the animal testing altogether. When they came to human testing, they tested it on 45 people. In the low-dose group, one of the people got so sick from the vaccine, they had to be hospitalized. That's 6%. In the high-dose group, 3 people got so sick, they had to be hospitalized. That's 20%. Mm-hmm. They're going ahead and making 2 billion doses of that vaccine. And by the way, the people that they test them on, Alan, are not typical Americans. They use what they call exclusionary criteria. They are only giving these vaccines in these tests that they're doing to the healthiest people. If you look at their exclusionary criteria, you cannot be pregnant. You cannot be overweight. You must have never smoked a cigarette. You must have never vaped. You must have no respiratory problems in your family. You can't suffer asthma. You can't have diabetes. You can't have rheumatoid arthritis or any autoimmune disease. There has to be no history of seizure in your family. These are the people they're testing the vaccine on. But that's not who they're going to give them to.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to go, what happens? These people are like the Avengers. They're like Superman. You can shoot them with a bullet and they won't go down. What happens when they give them to the typical American, Sally Six-Pack and Joe Bag of Donuts, who's 50 pounds overweight and has diabetes? What is going to happen then? You're not going to see 20%. You're going to see a lot of people dropping dead. These people. The problem is, Anthony Fauci put $500 million of our dollars into that vaccine. He owns half the patent. He has 5 guys who are working for him who are entitled to collect royalties from that. So you have a corrupt system, and now they've got a vaccine that is too big to fail. And instead of saying, hey, this was a terrible, terrible mistake, they're saying, we are going to order 2 billion doses of this. And you've got to understand, Alan, with these COVID vaccines, these companies are playing with house money. They're not spending anything on it, and they have no liability. So if they kill 20 people or 200 people, 2,000 people in their clinical trials, big deal. They have zero liability. And guess what? They've wasted their money because we're giving them the money to play with. Oh, people like me and people in our community are looking at this process, and we're saying, whatever comes out of that process, we don't want to take it, because we're seeing how the sausage gets made, and it's really sickening.
Here, I have no doubt that transparency in testing is essential. I don't understand why there isn't placebo testing and other testing later, after the initial vaccine. So, but isn't there a natural test that occurs? You say the pharmaceutical industry has nothing to lose, but look at what happened to the pharmaceutical companies that put forward some of the opiates. They have been driven out of business. Their names have been taken off buildings. They are regarded as pariahs in the world today. Certainly anybody who runs a pharmaceutical company cares deeply about not killing people. Certainly anybody who runs a pharmaceutical company cares deeply about not killing people. And even if the government doesn't mandate this kind of testing, and even if they give them exemption from financial liability, surely good people, and I think we assume that people who run companies today, I have a friend who's trying to develop one of the vaccines, and he's doing it without profit. He feels so strongly about the need to vaccinate people around the world. So I think you overstate it when you say that the people who are developing these vaccines have no concern whatsoever whether people...
The opiate people got busted, Alan, and by the way, no, they were not moral people. They knew what they were doing. They're killing 56,000 American young kids a year, knowing what they were doing. Or kids every year that were killed in the 20-year Vietnam War. These are not moral companies. And they only got busted because plaintiffs' attorneys could sue them.
I agree.
They got the discovery documents and walked them down to the U.S. Attorney's Office and said, hey, there's criminal behavior here. That can never happen in the vaccine space. You can't sue them. There's no discovery. There's no depositions. There's no class action suit. There's no multi-district litigation. There's no interrogatories, nothing. They never get caught. Now, these 4 companies that make all of our vaccines, all 72 of the vaccine shots that are now mandated for our children, every one of them is a convicted serial felon. Glaxo, Sanofi, Pfizer, Merck. In the past 10 years, just in the last decade, those companies have paid $35 billion in criminal penalties, damages, fines, for lying to doctors, for defrauding science, for falsifying science, for killing hundreds of thousands of Americans knowingly and getting away with it.
In a democracy, don't you have to follow the will of the majority. I agree. Transparency is all important. And so let's assume the legislature now passes a law. Every 50 states and the United States Congress passes a law requiring everybody to wear a mask when they're outdoors. Wouldn't you agree that it would be constitutional to mandate the wearing of masks, even if people have political, ideological, medical, religious objections, because A, the wearing of the mask is only an inconvenience, and it has the potential not to save the world, but to improve the possibility of not having communicable diseases. Wouldn't you agree that mandatory mask wearing would be constitutional?
Well, if I accepted all of your precedents, then perhaps I would. The thing is, I know a lot about the mask. In fact, there's a BMJ study from 2015 that says that the mask is actually likely to spread the disease and to make you less healthy because the carbon dioxide that you're breathing, and that the people who wear the mask are more likely to get sick. Let me just answer the other question you had. You said we have to rely on the majority. Well, I grew up in the state of Virginia, Alan. When I grew up, it was illegal because the majority voted that it was illegal for a black man to marry a white woman.
I agree.
It was illegal for blacks to vote. So the majority is not, no, in a democracy, you have the courts there that protect our rights. Oftentimes against the majority. And unfortunately, we are in a situation today where we have tremendous corruption, not only in Congress, which receives more money from pharmaceutical companies than any other industry. Pharmaceutical gives in lobbying twice the amount that oil and gas, which is the next big one, 4 times with defense and aerospace. There are more lobbyists, pharma lobbyists in Congress than there are members of Congress in the Senate. So we have lost the the legislative independence of that body. And unfortunately, Alan, the agencies are also captured. We just sued Monsanto. We got an historic judgment, a $12 billion settlement in the Monsanto case. And I was part of that trial team. And one of the things that happened during that trial is that EPA took a position against us. They took a position that glyphosate Roundup does not cause cancer. As it turns out, we got an internal memorandum that showed that the head of the pesticide division in EPA was actually working secretly for Monsanto and killing studies and twisting studies and ghostwriting studies to falsify the science. The CDC has an $11.5 billion budget, and $4.9 billion of that is buying and selling and distributing vaccines. CDC is a vaccine company. It owns 57 vaccine patents, so it can make money on every sale of a vaccine. And these regulatory agencies are actually vaccine companies. The vaccine marketing sales part of those agencies is the tail that is now wagging the regulatory dog. They are not doing their job as regulators. And in fact, the senior scientist at CDC today, the senior vaccine safety scientist, is the author or co-author on all of the major studies that CDC has produced on vaccine safety, and particularly the studies that show the vaccine does not cause autism. His name is Dr. William Thompson. 3 years ago, he came forward and he said, we have been ordered to fake all the science of the last decade on autism. And he said in that study, we found out that Black boys who get the MMR vaccine had a 363% greater risk of getting an autism diagnosis than Black. He said he was ordered by their CDC boss, Frank DiStefano, for them to destroy that data in front of them in CDC headquarters and then publish that study saying there is no effect.
Look, the reason I to do this debate is because I think you perform an important function by bringing out some of these ties, some of these connections. You perform an important function when you bring lawsuits against corrupt pharmaceutical companies. But my question is this: knowing all that you know now, and putting aside the issue of, let's assume we didn't have mandatory vaccinations. Let's assume you win that debate, and it's only voluntary vaccinations now. and they come forward with a vaccine that they say will stem the tide of the pandemic, and you're allowed to go on television on Anderson Cooper, would you urge all the American people not to take the vaccine? Would you become part of the campaign not to take the vaccine if it were voluntary? Explain why not.
Look, I'm not anti-vaccine. People call me anti-vaccine because of the way of marginalizing me and silencing me and saying,
that's why I'm asking you the question.
I'm not anti-vaccine. Look, Alan, I've been trying to get mercury out of fish for 37 years. Nobody calls me anti-fish.
God bless you. I support you on that 100%. But what would you do?
Let me just say
television. What would you tell the American public if a vaccine were available and if you were invited, say, to speak to members of the Black community, members of the Latino community, members of the general American community, and they said,
if they come out with the vaccine, it does what Bill Gates says it's going to do, which is you give one shot, you get lifetime immunity, and there are vanishingly rare serious injuries. I'm talking about deaths for brain damage, 1 in a million. That may be acceptable. In that case, and it works, and I'd say, I tell people, yeah, I'm going to get it. Let's go ahead and get it. Problem is with this vaccine is we don't know if the vaccine is going to kill more people when you start giving it to those people with the comorbidities. 54% of us has chronic disease. They're testing it on one group, and they're going to give it to another. And we need to know what the risk factor is in the people that they give it to. The flu vaccine is very much like the coronavirus vaccine, but we've had the flu vaccine for 90 years. So every year it's fine-tuned and perfected. And originally they told us the flu vaccine, you'll give one shot and you'll have immunity for life. And then it turned out, no, we need to get it every year.
Because there are variations of the flu.
Right, and the same thing is highly likely to happen with coronavirus. CDC said the flu vaccine is 35% effective. That's what they claim. Cochrane Collaboration said no. You have to give 100 flu shots to prevent one case of flu, number one. Number two, there is zero evidence that the flu shot prevents any hospitalizations or any deaths. Number three, the flu shot transmits the flu. In fact, if you get a flu shot, you're 6 times more likely to give somebody else the flu than if you didn't get the flu shot. And this is true, Alan, for many, many other shots. For example, the polio vaccine, which you know about, is so good at transmitting, giving polio to other people that 70% of the polio cases in the world today come from the vaccine. If you go to the chickenpox manufacturer's insert, it says if you get this chickenpox vaccine, you should not go near a pregnant woman for 6 weeks or anybody who's immunocompromised. Same with pertussis. You become an asymptomatic carrier. So you're not guaranteeing. And in fact, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, which is the other leader, when they gave it to monkeys, the monkeys continue to transmit the disease. And Bill Gates and Fauci have been going on TV saying, we may get a vaccine that protects you, but you may still be transmitting it. So why are you going to lock that guy up in a house? Look, and all people out who are now asymptomatic carriers because they got Gates' vaccine.
I listen to my doctor, who I love and admire, and has been taking care of me for years. Should I instead listen to you and not take the flu vaccine?
Nobody should listen to me. People need to do the science themselves. And you look at the vaccine inserts, Alan.
Yeah.
Look at some of the science. In a million years, I would not take the flu shot. And I'll tell you why, because this is what Cochrane and BMJ have found. People who take the flu shot are protected against that strain of flu. They're 4.4 times more likely to get a non-flu infection. And you might find, and a lot of people do, that they get the flu shot and then they get sick. They're usually not getting the flu. are getting something that is indistinguishable from the flu, because the flu shot gives you something called pathogenic priming. It injures your immune system so that you're more likely to get a non-flu viral upper respiratory infection. In fact, the Pentagon published a story in which they said that the flu shot not only primes you for flu, but it primes you for coronavirus. What they found is actually the people who got the flu shot were 36% more likely to get coronavirus. And that's not a lone study. We found 6 other major studies that say the same thing. If you get the flu shot, you're more likely to get coronavirus. And this is what the science says, and you should not listen to me. Nobody should.
I understand.
You should read the science. Look, all you have to do, Alan, and this is what Cochrane said, is look what's happened to longevity in the elderly since we started mandating the flu shot to elderly people. Those are the people who, their life expectancy has dramatically gone down as the flu shot proliferated.
So with all due respect, I don't understand the implications of your position. If you're right, why wouldn't it follow that the flu shot should be illegal? You said it's criminal to mandate the flu shot because it kills people in my age category. So if you had to cast the deciding vote, if you had decided to run for Congress instead of doing the great work you've done over so many years, and you were the deciding vote in the United States Senate, and there was a bill to outlaw the flu shot, why wouldn't you vote for it if you think
I'm kind of a free market guy, and I think, I'm against mandates. I think that, there may be situations where, where that product might do some good for somebody, but I just don't believe it should be mandated.
Certainly anybody who runs a pharmaceutical company cares deeply about not killing people.
Because we're seeing how the sausage is made, and it's really sickening.